Welcome to Engaging Whiteness in Your Congregation, a conversation with Robert Jones, author of White Too Long, and panelist Carol McEntyre, who is pastor of First Baptist Church, Columbia, Missouri, Ryon Price, pastor of Broadway Baptist Church in Fort Worth, Texas, and Gerardo Marti, who is acting chair of the Department of Sociology and professor of sociology at Davidson College. And of course, you. We're glad you're here. My name is Paula Clayton Dempsey, and I serve the Alliance of Baptists as Director of Partnership Relations. I serve alongside Gerardo Marti as one of the directors of the Churches That Thrive for Racial Justice Project, which is seeking to bring into reality the commitment outlined in the Alliance of Baptists' newly revised covenant and mission, which says, guided by the Spirit, we commit to act to dismantle systems of white supremacy, patriarchy, and abuse of power. So today's webinar specifically focuses on the work and the role of the local church in cultivating a more racially just world. To guide our conversation, we are blessed to have these two local church pastors who, in their context, they have made commitments to guide their congregations in reckoning with the church's complicity in upholding white supremacy. So they'll be engaging Robbie Jones with their questions and thoughts on ways that his book, White Too Long, could be used in the local church to talk publicly about things that have for way too long been individualized and privatized. So, of course, you will have questions and you will have comments, and we welcome all of those. So please write those in the chat throughout the course of the webinar. We will address as many of those as time allows. But now as we begin, I'd like to center us just for a moment with the words of a hymn text that were written by Mary Louise Bringle that I've adapted just a little bit for today as words of centering and our prayer as we begin. Sing a new world into being. Sound a bold and hopeful theme. Find a tune for silent yearnings. Lend your voice and dare to dream. Dream a church where all who worship find their lives and loves belong. Sing a new world into being. Sing as Christ inspires your song. Bring a new world into being where each gender, class, and race bring its rainbow gifts and colors to God's limitless embrace. Where the lines that once divided form instead the ties that bind. Bring a new world into being. Risk transforming heart and mind. Thanks be to God for this time together today, and thanks for our participants and our panelists, and I invite you, Carol, to begin our conversation.
Thank you, Paula. So good to be with you all today. As Paula said, I'm Carol McEntyre. I am the senior pastor at First Baptist Church in Columbia, Missouri. First Baptist was founded in 1823, just 3 years after the Missouri Compromise, which admitted Missouri into the Union as a slave-holding state. So some of our founding members were slaveholders, and during the first 4 decades of our church's life, we had a gospel that was compatible with chattel slavery, to borrow some language from your book, Robbie. We also had, interestingly, a few freedmen who were members of our church during that time, and in 1840, we admitted a freedman into membership and then licensed him to preach specifically to the Black population in Columbia. And our church history, when you read it, I think it describes it in this kind of paternalistic way. It says he, quote, possessed a respective gift as a public speaker in the cause of Christ. So When I read our history, I think that we saw ourselves as kind of benevolent masters in that theological hierarchy that you talk about a lot in the book, Robbie. And I'll give you another example of that. Dr. William Jewell, who was the founder of William Jewell College, was a founding member of First Baptist Church. He was a Missouri state senator and a very prominent Baptist layman, and he was a slave owner. If you read what First Baptist and others say about him, it's often pointed out that during his career as a state senator, he fought to abolish whipping posts and pillories, and he is often called a humanitarian for these efforts. And it's always noted that upon his death, he freed his slaves. I also find it really interesting that in 1834, we kicked out Jesse Turner, who was a member of our congregations, for trading slaves and for drinking. I find this so interesting. Why would we kick someone out for trading slaves when other people in our church owned slaves? And maybe it was the drinking that actually got him kicked out. But then reading your book, Robbie, I also wondered if it was perhaps the way he treated his slaves that got him kicked out. And, we don't know. I could say a lot more about our early history. We actually know quite a bit about it, but I'm going to fast forward. Today, and I would say for, several decades, we have seen ourselves as a very progressive congregation, and we want, to be allies and anti-racists in our work. And in 2017, after the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, we launched a racial justice team, which has recently rebooted again with some work we're doing with the Alliance. And the team is committed to looking at our church's, history, to educating our congregation about white supremacy, and to taking anti-racist action. So I guess my first question for you is, Robbie, what does it mean for a church like ours to really not just know our history, but to contend with it?
Yeah, well, thanks, Carol. That it's heartening to hear, what's going on. I mean, I think to some extent you're doing it. I mean, I think so many churches don't know their own history, and the reason why they don't know it is because they read that bound version of the history that's in the church library, right, which always talks about the founders of the church in such glowing terms, and it's more of a those stories are more self-congratulatory pieces of propaganda than they are critical histories of the church. So I think just rediscovering those stories and telling those, having the courage to tell those stories about this is who we are, right? This is from whence we come, and what does that mean for us today? And I think what you're describing about after that Unite the Right rally in 2017, other people, I think 2015, Dylan Roof, killing people and while they were at church, killing 9 African Americans at church in Charleston. 2017, the Unite the Right rally. These are things I've heard a lot as kind of catalyzing events of saying, okay, we have to do something different than just kind of plod along and, kind of feel pretty good about a general social justice platform or something, but to really think harder about how deep our assumptions about race and who we are. And I'll probably a lot of what I'll say will echo this. For me, the journey that I went on, that I've kind of been on, but the journey that the book took me on, I think, was telling those stories and telling them as far back as I could go, right? So 1820 is pretty far back, but if you ask the other questions about, well, where do we get the land that the church sits on, right? And that was built on in 1820, right? Then you get a whole other set of stories about Native American forced removal, from lands that was also justified, right, by a kind of white supremacist manifest destiny, things rooted, in this idea that America was white Christians' own private promised land. So, I think the biggest thing for me, the biggest starting point is just having the courage to tell those stories and to kind of have that become part of the identity of the congregation is its wrestling with this complicated history and stories, because all of those have implications about what our responsibilities are today.
Robbie, thanks so much for joining us with this conversation. I'm Ryon Price. I'm the senior pastor at Broadway Baptist Church in Fort Worth. I actually have pastored here for almost 4 years. I began my tenure, was actually called to pastor here the Sunday following the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville. So it seems sort of like the beginning of a new era for social justice, specifically racial justice in America. So really my engagement, Robbie, with your book began last year with an interview you gave with BJC, and it came for me at what I saw as an exceedingly critical moment of time with all of the huge demographic shifts that you've worked on and mentioned in other contexts, the end of white Christian America, at the time, an upcoming presidential election in the midst of a global pandemic, and then the murder of George Floyd. All of these events taking place all at one time combined to, for me, put conversations about race and systemic racism front and center in my mind, and was really looking for ways to engage that. Then, of course, it's followed on with an insurrection at the Capitol. So we are very much still in the midst, perhaps even in the early stages of a new era around these important issues. And the interview you gave inspired me to read the book. And in reading the book, then that really inspired me in my own context to write what I think has been one of the most important letters I've ever written, perhaps the most important to the congregation, sort of a pastoral letter outlining something which I called ACT, which is really the beginning of kind of an attempt at reformation through the lens of race within our own context. Our church has been around since 1882. And that means we are a church with a lot of history, some good, some bad, some ugly, of course. And I think for me, this idea of ACT was one related to a more general theme of James saying, be not only hearers, but also be doers, be actors, but then also ACT as an acronym for acknowledge, confess, and transform. And having read your book, Robbie, sort of as a mirror in my own congregational context, a lot of other churches that you were mentioning really did mirror the story of Broadway. We had some conversations with Scott Dickinson, who is featured prominently in the book, and his congregation really sort of carried a parallel track. And so we formed this council, which is called ACT here at Broadway, which has some certain very specific desired outcomes, which we have outlined. And there are about 30 or 40 people on the council. And the desired outcomes are one, to create what we have called a justice committee, a standing justice committee within our own congregation. That was sort of one of the low-hanging fruits within our church ACT work to go ahead and begin working in that direction. They can make statements, work on justice-related issues, things like housing, healthcare, voting rights, immigration. We sort of started moving on all of those fronts. But then a second thing is the rewriting of our own bylaws and a recognition that specifically around issues of membership and the explicit affirmation of people of color, the LGBTQ community, and those from other denominations. I think we sort of took a big picture in this and saying, race is one thing, and but there's also this broader context of exclusion, which has taken place within our own context, and so we recognize that the body of Christ has been fractured. So anything which has in some kind of way divided us, we want to explicitly articulate welcome and inclusion, and it in our bylaws to codify it, to make it a part of our seminal language as a body. Those have sort of been the easy things. More difficult, I think, in some ways, has been the study of our own history as a church. And as I said, we were formed in 1882. We have a history with white supremacy. And that was one of the things, Robbie, kind of wrestled with your book and how public to make it, because that term white supremacy can be a challenge. But I think it was really important that we begin to articulate that and say those terms. And so we've begun to do a lot of digging on the history of our own congregation. And part of that comes out of the fact that there is a pastor in your book that figures very prominently as Pastor Douglas Hudgens, who in your book was pastor at the time of the Civil Rights Movement in the 60s, pastor of First Baptist Jackson, pastor of, sometimes been called the pastor of the closed society. He was the one whose church was attempted to be integrated by Medgar Evers just before Evers was assassinated. Well, he was pastor not only of First Baptist Jackson, but before that in the 1930s, he was pastor of Broadway. And so we have really recognized that a lot of his history as a pastor shaped who we were in the 1930s and in the 1940s. In fact, through some research that I've done, I discovered that there were a couple of bombings in Jackson, one of a rabbi's home and another of a synagogue, where the rabbi accused Pastor Hudgens of not saying anything, saying if you had spoken against this would not have taken place. And then through my own history, just recently I discovered that the home of a Miss Opal Lee, who is from Fort Worth and is the grandmother of Juneteenth nationally, her home was burned on the 19th of June in 1939 when Pastor Hudgens was here. And there's no record of him saying anything against that as well. She was a Black community, Black residents moving into a white neighborhood just blocks from my own church. And the record is silence. So we're really, really wrestling with that right now, the ways in which we as a congregation have been shaped, the ways in which white supremacy really did shape us, even though that term was not something that we've embraced fully. I think that's part of the challenge of the ongoing kind of story for us, is recognizing that we're wrestling with that. And without being more wordy, one of the things I would like to ask you about, Robbie, is what kind of response you have received around that language of white supremacy. And I recognize also that our conversation here is titled Engaging Whiteness. And so I'm a little curious about how you might see whiteness and white supremacy as terms of connection, and also where in your mind they might diverge if they do. So that's my sort of context, and then question for you, Robbie.
Oh, thanks, Ryan. And I'm really moved hearing about the work you all have done and the role that the book has played. I'm really humbled by that. I'm really glad you brought this up. I wrestled a lot with it in writing the book, about how to describe what I was talking about. And do I use the term white supremacy? Do I use some euphemism like white dominance, or some other kind of thing that sort of means the same thing but doesn't have the same kind of baggage with it? And at the end of the day, not only in the text, but wrestling with whether it should be in the title of the book, which it is, right? The subtitle of the book is "The Legacy of White Supremacy in American Christianity," and I decided at the end of the day, I needed to just go straight at it rather than talking around it. And I spend a little bit of time in the book talking about it, because not only because of my own wrestling with the term, but because I just, you could just see the recoil among most white people who haven't really thought about this much. If you say we're going to have a conversation about white supremacy, they think it has nothing to do with them, or we think it has nothing to do with us. And one of the reasons why that is because we immediately, and what I've said is that if you could take a kind of little internal mental camera into most white people's heads and most white Christians' heads, and just take a quick snapshot of what happens when they hear the term white supremacy, I think what it mostly looks like is a very aged and faded black and white photo of the KKK burning a cross or lynching someone or something, or some kind of still out of D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation, right? That's what I think is in the head. And so that is very far away from the day-to-day experience of most contemporary, white Christians today. But I think the reason why that's there is we should unpack that a little bit. I think it's actually kind of a defensive mechanism, right? Is that if I can make white supremacy be locked into that faded black and white photograph, that puts it historically distant from me. It puts it culturally distant from me. And if I can link it to only acts of overt violence and terrorism, it also puts it kind of culturally, a long way from where I am, and something I don't have to deal with. And I borrowed a term from Eddie Glaude, who's written a great book on James Baldwin called Begin Again. And he talked about the need for us to reinterrogate the term and to talk about what he calls white supremacy without all the bluster. And I found it helpful just to turn the words around, instead of saying, let's talk about white supremacy, let's talk about a history of supporting the supremacy of whites, right? Mm-hmm. And if you just kind of take it out of that kind of proper noun term and kind of say, and you talk about it that way, I mean, there's no white church in America that's been around, for any period of time that doesn't have a history promoting the supremacy of whites in their community. That's just historically a fact. And so then it's a much, then it's a much broader question about bigger things that matter. So things like, the fact that I was so struck by a report I read about a study that was done about the private Christian academies that cropped up in the 1960s and 1970s, right? And the report actually said, if you visit a private school in the South and it has the word Christian in it, it is most likely that it sprung up in the 1960s and 1970s in response to Brown v. Board of Education, right? That this was a kind of across the board, very common response. And just like that itself. So where was the church on school desegregation? Where was the church on the civil rights movement? Where was the church on slavery, if it's been around, much longer than that? And I think this example of Hudgens that you gave, I won't go on too much longer, but I'll add one more little piece to this, Ryan, because you're totally right about him calling out the rabbi, calling out Hudgens on television, actually saying, if you had spoken out, my synagogue and my home would not have been bombed, right? Tried to kill my family. One other little piece is that as Hudgens rose to the pulpit that next Sunday in Jackson, he made a brief mention about the event and then turned to preach on a text that had absolutely nothing to do with anything but private individual salvation. And the transition line that he used from this kind of brief announcement over to this private kind of text about a kind of private interior religiosity were the words, "The Lord works in mysterious ways." Like that was the transition that he gave his congregation as they moved to this other text. It's just chilling when you kind of see those kinds of wink, wink, nod, nod moves that everybody knew, right, what he was saying, to the congregation. And those things just are so deep and so kind of assumed and part of the fabric. I think that's the thing. So I think just kind of talking about, again, the supremacy of whites and what role Christianity has played in supporting a worldview, whether it can be prison sentences, it can be zoning laws, it can be school desegregation. I mean, there's all kinds of ways that this has had very concrete form, not some abstract thing in somebody's head, but like actual things on the ground. So who could get the best jobs? Who could go to the better schools? Who could go to which pools and parks that were public, right, in the city? All of these things, there was a kind of an effort to reserve these goods for whites, and churches played a role in supporting that in that worldview. So I think it's really important to just kind of take that piece of it on, and that brings it, I think, much closer home. And I guess the last thing I'll say about the white piece, too, and then we'll move on, but is I do think it's really important for not only the supremacy of whites, but that white piece to be unpacked. And it doesn't take that long. I did a lot of reading of James Baldwin, working on the book, and he just points out over and over in interviews that he gave, like, look, white people really became white here in the U.S., right? In Europe, they were French, they were British, they were German, and then later they were Italian or Irish. Those people weren't white when they got to the U.S., right, in the 19th century. It wasn't until the 20th century that those people kind of got admitted, if you will, to kind of whiteness in the 20th. So it's a very interesting term. And one toehold I think we have in the current thing is, and just kind of a practical idea I've been thinking about, is everyone's getting those little DNA tests, right, that kind of print back a map of, like, what your kind of genome tells you you're from. Bringing those in and talking about those, right, even if they're, like, in my case, mine is actually fairly circumscribed to the British Isles, and kind of, so, and like Norway, Finland, like, it's very tight. But even so, right, to understand, like, oh, actually Jones, Welsh, right, my people from Wales, right, and England, that's different than white. And even if it's very small, like, what does it mean then that I've grown up thinking myself as white instead of Welsh? And why did that matter? And what did it get me, I think, is the other question, by talking about and understanding myself as white.
That's really helpful, Robbie. And I just want to say, I appreciate very much that you chose to use the language of white supremacy in your book title, and maybe fought back a little bit against publishers who maybe thought it wouldn't sell as well. But I think I've heard you on other occasions, saying we have to get comfortable with that language. And I just appreciate you pushing us on that. So thank you. I think that a question that emerges for me as we talk about just the history of our churches is, how do we deal with, as pastors, the guilt that comes up for people about this? Church members often say things like, this history is heartbreaking, it's too much, which kind of makes them want to pull back. Or on the flip side, I also occasionally hear church members say, am I supposed to feel guilty? So how would you have us address that in our congregations?
Yeah. So I think it's about where are we going and what is the end game? That I think to kind of keep that in mind is really helpful. So in 2011, I had a kind of scary bout with colon cancer. And there's two things I think are relevant about that. One, I had to get comfortable with the word cancer, right? It took me a while to even want to say that word, but I realized if I was going to get my head around what was happening with me, I had to learn to say that word in conversation. I think that's kind of a parallel to white supremacy. I think we really have to get comfortable with talking about that. And then, the other thing you're called upon to do if you want to get healthy, or have an opportunity to be healthy, is you've got to, face some pretty daunting treatment in that setting, right? And the treatment's really unpleasant. Has unpleasant side effects. It makes you feel bad. And the reason why you put up with it, even for some of it that feels like it might itself kill you, is because you've got health in mind on the other side, right? Is that you think that if I can kind of walk through this, I can get to a place of health. And so I think a couple of things that have pulled me through is to and continue to pull me through in this conversation, in these conversations, and in this work, is the sense that we're deeply ill. I think we've got to get our heads around that. Like this has made us sick. And Kierkegaard talks about the sickness unto death, right? It's a deeply, we're talking like stage 3, stage 4 cancer here. That's the kind of sickness that we're facing. And so, and if we can kind of, we got to give up the thought, I think, that if we do nothing, maybe things would be better if we handled it, but it'll be okay if we don't. I actually don't think we're going to be okay if we don't deal with this, right? We won't. And so I think if we want a healthy church, and I think the other thing that has really helped me on the guilt front, right? Because I mean, in the book, I write a lot about my family, right? My family's history with this, and those aren't easy things to deal with. They're not. I mean, so I think to just acknowledge that, yes, this is really difficult work. There's gonna be a lot of feelings of like shame, guilt, anger, like all kinds of like emotions that we don't like to sit with, but the goal, I think, at the end of the day is not to make us feel bad. I mean, the goal is to get us healthy, right? And so when I think about the choices we're making and what makes it worth it, what makes doing this work worth it, I think about my kids. I think about the next generation, and I think like what more noble work could there be for the current generation to take this moment in time and to say, we are going to talk about a good emotion, to take some pride in saying, we're going to be the generation, right, that puts an end to this. Like, we are going to be the ones that disentangles our faith from these like wicked, awful associations with white supremacy. Like, we're going to be the ones to do this, right? That's really noble work we can be proud of, I think. And if we're, and I think if I try to put it starkly, I think, okay, look, I can get tangled up and wrapped up in feelings of loyalty to my ancestors, and that pulls me kind of one direction. But I can also get pretty tangled up and fired up about loyalty to my kids and my grandchildren, right? And I if I'm going to have to pick between those two, I would rather pick my kids and my grandchildren to where my loyalties lie, and have a forward-looking work that I know I mean, that really is the, if we think about being faithful and like what each generation's job is, it is to take what we've received, right, to kind of hold it in our hands and to hand down to the next generation the best version of that we can, right? And we've got an opportunity that I think, because of the moment we're in, and it kind of speak theologically, because the way the Spirit is moving in our midst, an opportunity to do something that previous generations could not even see.
Robbie, I would just maybe respond and say, when you're saying thinking theologically, I think the church is well poised to actually engage this conversation because of what we do believe theologically, or what we've preached, taught, said for centuries. It was stated a moment ago in the chat talking about moral injury, and that's really a way in which I've engaged a lot of this question, is looking at this as a moral injury to white people as well, and to white America, and certainly to the white church. And I think the church has taught that we have a deep connection to the sins of the past. I mean, that is seminal in our understanding. We were all in Adam, and it's things that we've been teaching for so long. And I saw something on Facebook the other day. It was like a little meme, like, you're telling me that I'm guilty of the sins of a guy millions of years ago named Adam, but we can't go all the way back to 1619. So it's like, we actually have this language. And so a person in our ACT council was saying, I know it's irrational that I feel guilty about what my forebears did. And I was kind of thinking, actually, I think there is a rationality to it. And Michael Ray Matthews says it's bone deep. It's in our DNA. And I mean, literally inside of us, we were in Adam, and we were in these stories of people's actions and complicity. And I think it's a theological challenge for us that we have to engage, but what a blessing that we actually have the theological richness to say, this is our understanding. And so one of the things we've been engaging is our membership statement about a personal Savior, and kind of looking at where does that come out of? And it sounds like it comes out of about a 1930s Douglas Hudgens concept. But our sin is so much deeper than just the personal. And so we have to have this richness to engage the shame. And that's a hard task for pastors and for churches, for sure.
Well, let me ask a question. Gerardo Marti at Davidson College, I'm glad to be a part of this conversation. Robbie, thank you so much for all the work that you do. And of course, we appreciate the work that the pastors are doing in leading their congregations through such incredible and deep and very, very controversial, polarizing kinds of issues. I think that when you read the media today, you find a lot of people who have concluded that the church has been the problem. And so we just need to get rid of the church. But I'd like to think that the church can certainly be a part of actually working through this, and that perhaps it can't really thoroughly be worked through if churches do not come on board. And so, Robbie, what I'd like to ask you, and then of course, Carol and Ryan, I'm sure would have something to say, is what is the distinctive role of the church, of congregations, to doing this kind of anti-racist work? What kinds of things do you think of when you think of that?
Wow, that's a great question. And it's one of the reasons why I end the book with some congregations is because I think it's so vital to us getting anywhere, right, on this. And it's exactly right. I mean, that, it's right to say that, I think the language I use in the book is that, white Christian churches have been the central tent pole holding up this worldview. And so if that's true, and I think there's plenty of evidence that it is, then I think it can also be the central tent pole of holding up an alternative, right, in our day. And in fact, because it's played that role, it may be the only institution that can change it, right, because it's been so often structured that way. And the other thing I think is that because it is such a difficult challenge, I think, or a journey, I think for many, for myself and for people who've grown up thinking themselves as white, that you need a community, right? It's you can read a book, you can get in a book club, and that's a kind of community, but you need a kind of community for the long haul, I think, on this. And really churches at their best are about that, right? About helping people walk on a lifelong journey of learning and faithfulness, and finding the truth and getting clearer about the truth and taking, putting another foot forward and another foot forward and doing that among a group of people who are stumbling along and trying to figure it out and not perfect and all that, but also with some leadership that's intentional about being on a journey, right? And naming the fact that we're on a journey, right? This is what we're doing. And here are some steps that we're going to take. That's transformative, I think. And it's something that's very hard, I think, maybe impossible for people to do by themselves, right? Because I think so much of it is, again, to kind of use, we're talking with a lot of pastors in a religious setting, but bearing witness, giving our testimonies, right? These kinds of things are important, not only for kind of helping, kind of put out into the world the journey that I'm on, but it ends up being familiar and helping other people, right? And their own way of formulating their own stories. And one of the reasons why I tried to write in the first person in this book was precisely because of that, because I know in my own life, it's been when people have been willing to be vulnerable and tell me their story, that's what starts changing things in me. And so it was really about trying to just say, like, it's a right. That's why we give testimonies. That's why we make space for that in congregations, because it's transformative, right? And when we see what God is doing in one person's life, it helps us on our own journey. So I think that that's a big part of it. And the other thing to say is this: look, we have seen the results of a top-down approach on this. I mean, if you only read the denominational statements put out on civil rights and racism, you would think we had made all kinds of progress, right? But those statements never made it down into the pews. So I think we really do need a kind of grassroots level, so that, you know, what we end up with is the denominational stuff reflecting what's happening. And it's probably a little bit of both. But I mean, I was just so struck in the, you know, if you read the statements by the National Council of Churches, if you read statements by the Council of Bishops, I mean, you would think we'd tackled racism a long time ago, right? And that it had been regularly, the kind of stuff we're talking about now had been regularly taught in the churches since the 1970s, and it's just not so. So I think this kind of work, where you got, a big committee of lay people engaged with clergy and then supported by a denominational structure. I mean, I think that's a really a strong way for this kind of work to happen, and it creates space for people to just find their way. I mean, this is a journey after all, and we're talking about, you know, changing the way white Christians have thought about themselves that was established over 4 centuries. So, you know, this is going to be a long journey to undo this.
So in your research, Robbie, you found that Christians, whether they be evangelical, mainline, or Catholic Christians, are more likely to hold racist views. And I think this tells us that there is something profoundly corrupt, you know, in our theology, if this is possible. So what aspects of your theology have you had to rethink as you've come to grips with all of this? And I think this is a role that pastors can really play. So what aspects of our theology should we be helping our congregations rethink?
Yeah, right. So, I mean, you know, I've got a bunch of statistics and fancy models and all that to kind of, you know, back this up, but in the book. But I mean, essentially what I found in just a nutshell, just to kind of put a sharp point on it, is that if you take your average white, non-Hispanic American and you add Christianity, they become more racist, right? They score higher on this racism index that I have in the book. And overall, church attendance makes very little difference at all. In other words, that effect is just as strong among high church attenders as it is among low church attenders. And in fact, in the case of white evangelicals, the relationship is actually the opposite of what you might think. That is, the relationship between identifying as a white evangelical and a high score on the racism index is actually stronger among high attending evangelicals than low attending evangelicals, right? So it tells you that yes, there is something in the theology, in the institution itself, that is actually pushing people that direction. And I think that one of I have to spend a little bit of time. I have a whole chapter on theology called "Believing" in the book, where I kind of try to ferret out some of this. Ryan already mentioned one. I think it is this. There may be no doctrine that has done more damage in terms of supporting white supremacist thinking and blinding white Christians to racial injustice than this idea of a personal relationship with Jesus. You know, if there was something I heard every Sunday growing up, it was having a personal relationship with Jesus. It was like every Sunday there was an invitation. There was, like, you know, and the sermons were crafted around that. And of course, like in itself, you know, it has a kind of integrity to it. But what's notable about it, and why the question is that, like, when the way it was structured to be so central, in fact, like I would say, and the way Christianity was presented to me growing up as a Southern Baptist in the South, is that was essentially the beginning and the end of my faith, right? Is that it was about having this personal relationship with Jesus, and that's it. And not much else really mattered, frankly. And so if you think about it that way, it's a very a kind of theology by design that is kind of blinds you to any sort of systemic injustice, right? Because if me and Jesus are fine, and it's a kind of interior affective kind of sensibility, then all the injustice in the world stacked up around the door, outside the stained glass windows, they don't really have any room to get any traction on my faith. And I think that's one of the deepest challenges, because that has become so central, I think, particularly in evangelical circles, to kind of broaden that out, so that we think of, because you can hardly even read Amos, Hosea, Exodus with that theology, right? From the standpoint of that theology, you can hardly even read those books in the Bible. So a more expansive view, I think, that allows these calls to social justice, and to remember that in both the Old Testament and the New Testament, we have texts that put in the mouth of God, like, don't come to the altar if something is wrong between you or your brother and sister, right? I mean, that is so clear, right, in both testaments, that and that has to be central to our faith. But really, I would say that the faith I was raised was the opposite of that. It was like, just come to the altar. Don't worry about your brother and sister in many ways, unless they were inside the stained glass, those four walls in the stained glass in the community you're in.
Gerardo, I want to respond to your question a moment ago about the role of the church, and kind of tell you something that someone on our staff did last year. Our pastor for families led a study of the book Stamped from the Beginning for children. And this was a Wednesday night collection of parents and also fifth and sixth graders coming together. And I'm just thinking about ways in which, we are in the midst of a major conversation around CRT and the teaching of American history, and our understanding of who it is that we are, what has happened, what can be given an account for. And, it may well be that the church is going to be the only place in Texas where CRT can legally be taught in a classroom. And I don't think I'm overstating that, but when you look at the actual kinds of language that's being put forth in our own legislature when it comes to CRT, and of course CRT could be anything, right? And so we may have to be preparing ourselves to teach a more truthful, honest articulation of what has happened. And I think for me, that's a part of the acknowledging and confessing. I think there is that confessional aspect of the liturgical aspect of confession, of helping a people to understand and acknowledge and be able to articulate. And then the final thing is, and one of the things that it's also one of our desired outcomes, is reparation. And what does that mean? And Robbie gets into that a little bit in the book, but that's an important part, I think, of our calling as churches, especially churches as old as the one I pastor, is what does it mean to make reparation in a way that is healing and redemptive for all people, and goes beyond glib confessions of general guilt, without the more particular kinds of understandings of what it is that we have to do in order to rectify the wrongs.
Just say, like, one quick note on critical race theory. I've kind of started being very careful about wanting to make the point that I don't use the word CRT debate anymore, because I think that it's really not a debate. It is a discourse that really has been coordinated. It's really a coordinated propaganda movement. We should just be really clear about talking about it that way. And when we ask why now, it's because it's reacting. It's a reactive propaganda movement that is reacting to this moment of reckoning that we're having on racial justice in the country. And it's really a defensive attempt to prevent and preempt an honest reading of our history of our country and our churches. I mean, that's really what it is about, which would be, I think, really clear about noting that. And I think it's because this wind is blowing, right? The Spirit is moving, I would say. And it's calling on a kind of accountability from white people and white Christians in particular. And this kind of straw man argument about CRT is really a way to just dodge the bullet and to really dodge any attempt at confession, really, and really acknowledgement of what's happened to the country. But I'll kind of go back real quick, Ryan, to this other point. I just want to make sure I said that. But at the very end of the book, I quote Baldwin about saying, he has a kind of very helpful way of talking about the civil rights movement in a very pithy way. He says, the civil rights movement began when a group of people who had been discriminated against began to wake up as to what had happened to them. That's Baldwin's words. And I think the moment we're in, right, is if you kind of want to translate that, I think we're in a moment where I'm hoping that white Christians are waking up to what has happened to us. Right. And back to this thing of like we've been damaged by this. Like, if you think about what we had to do to make our faith compatible with enslaving other people based on the color of their skin, what we had to do to make our faith compatible with teaching that we were superior to other people based on the color of our skin, and all the distortions we had to build into our faith to make those two things work together and into our psyches. And I think, this moment, the reason why we're seeing so much energy behind the CRT thing is because this moment is upon us, right? This moment of reckoning is upon us, and there really is a kind of fork in the road. Here we can continue to try to kick the can down the road, but I think we're at a moment where that's going to be harder to do. So it really is about circling the wagons, trying to defend territory, or a new kind of accountability, a new kind of paradigm that I really hope that white Christian churches will take the responsibility to do it, and to do it not just for all the people we've wronged. I mean, that's absolutely right, but to do it for ourselves. It's not really an altruistic move at the end of the day. This is about healing the damage that has been done to us. Again, so we don't hand that down to our kids.
Thank you so much, Robbie, for again just cutting through kind of all the BS about critical race theory and painting it very clearly for us as propaganda. We need that. So you've been speaking, hearing you gives me so much hope. And I know in the book you asked the question, is Christianity redeemable? Which I think is a fabulous question when you see how truly entangled it is with white supremacy. So I wonder, since the book came out, like, what signs of hope have you seen that maybe would answer that question, or not? Is Christianity redeemable?
Thanks. It's a great question. It's essentially the question Jamar Tisby asked when he reviewed my book in the New York Times last year. I would say this. So I turned in the manuscript to the book at the end of 2019. It came out in the middle of 2020, exactly a year ago, last week, actually. So the book's been out exactly a year. The paperback just came out last week. And at the end, I have about a 6 or 7 page afterword at the end. I actually take up this question a little bit in that afterword, because when I turned in the book, we had not seen any of the events of 2020, right, happen yet when I turned in the manuscript to the book. So I'll give you a couple examples. I spent several weeks in Richmond doing research, digging through archives at the United Daughters of the Confederacy and other places in Richmond, and doing some archival work. And when I was there, all those statues to the Confederacy were still standing as they had been for 100 years in Richmond. And I just took a few weeks ago, or last month, took a little cycling tour through Richmond down Monument Avenue, and they're all gone. They were all removed in the summer after the killing of George Floyd. And one of those is First Baptist Richmond, is a church that's built on one of those traffic circles that had one of those massive monuments, and in fact was one of 6 churches. This is remarkable to me, that when Monument Avenue was established with these big Confederate monuments going out on the west side of Richmond, and they were establishing as kind of a white elite neighborhood out there, no fewer than 6 that I could confirm churches uprooted themselves from downtown to replant themselves around these traffic circles facing these monuments to the Confederacy. First Baptist was one of those churches. And I was really struck that when they're facing the Stonewall Jackson monument, and when the statue was being removed by this big crane, the church staff actually rang the bell in affirmation of that statue coming down. Now that's a big deal, not only because of the history of that church, but that bell had been with them when they were back downtown before the Civil War. They had actually offered that bell to be melted down into cannon for the Confederacy. And the Confederacy didn't take it. Actually, a church member stepped up and made a donation to the Confederacy to save the bell. So they kept the bell. It moved with them. So this arc, right, it's kind of one symbol, but this arc of a bell that a white Christian congregation was so committed to the Confederacy and to slavery that they were going to give their own church bell to be made into an instrument of death and war on behalf of slavery, could come full circle and be rung in celebration of the removal of the symbol of white supremacy. That gives me a lot of hope, right? And my one other just quick thing, my home state of Mississippi, for the first time since 1894, does not have the Confederate battle flag in its state flag. And that happened also in 2020, also as a result of activists, Black Lives Matter activists working. And I will say, finally, the leadership of the Mississippi Baptist Convention finally stepping up and urging the governor to sign the bill to remove the Confederate flag after being completely silent on that issue forever. So I think I'm a little more hopeful. And even when I see some signs of resistance, like these bills, these CRT bills trying to hamstrung our educational systems across the country, you get those kinds of reactions when the threat of change is coming. And so I even read those as giving me some signs of hope that, again, the Spirit's moving, there are things happening, and the work you all are doing on the ground is like so important for that happening.
Well, I wanted to join the conversation again to say the chat has been lively if you all, as the panelists, have had a chance to look at it. Several folks have just said thanks for the hope that they are hearing here. There was a question earlier asking how do you intentionally introduce this conversation? So we've got some folks who are listening to this who need help introducing. So, our part of our hope from this webinar was folks might see this book as a vehicle for introducing this conversation into your congregation. Yes, Carol's holding it up. And then there was another question about how young people could be helpful in guiding this conversation in congregations. So, I wanted to give the other panelists a chance. Is there anything else you want to add? Is there something else you want to say, Gerardo, Carol, Ryan, in response to those questions, especially Carol and Ryan, as you are pastors? And Gerardo, do you have a closing remark before we've got to get off? So, 20 seconds, 30 seconds, how they do on PBS NewsHour. You got 20 seconds.
20 seconds. Ooh.
Oh, go ahead, Carol.
I was just going to say, I felt convicted by Robbie's comment that we can't kick the can down the road. So we can't say the next generation is going to be the one. So wait till people die off. But I also felt inspired by Ryan's comment about teaching children and youth, and thought that is a fabulous idea. And I want to do that in my congregation to read some of that history.
Yeah, we have some youth members serving on our ACT Council, and they have contributed really some great things. But I love the story that came out of our study of how to be a stamp from the beginning for kids. And one of our sixth graders who said, I want to know the truth, and I mean the real truth. So we're in the midst of this school district saying, oh, protect the kids from the truth because they're going to be harmed. No, it's the truth that's going to set these kids free. And they know it. And this child is asking to be told the real truth. That to me is very powerful and hopeful.
I just want to quickly say that there are millions of Christians, millions of seminarians who have never encountered spiritual leaders who have addressed things in this way. So to provide this as a bold witness and as an example, as a mentoring, as a model, it's pioneering work and it matters. So thank you, Robbie, especially for stimulating us and thinking about this and how to accomplish it.
Yeah. And we know that one webinar, one book study won't complete the work that is ours. It is the work of our ministries and our lifetimes. So I appreciate that there are more questions than we could respond to. Keep sending them, email them to me, Paula at allianceofbaptist.org, and the Alliance will try to help hold more spaces like this, for we are committed to accompanying congregational leaders as together we seek to live in joy, humility, and gratitude, welcoming the realm of God. So as I opened us, I wanted to close us with the final stanza of this hymn from Mary Louise Bringle. Beautiful hymn, look it up. Bring a new world into being. Join the ancient prophet's cry for a time of health and plenty when all tears have been wiped dry. When compassion flows like waters pouring balm for all who grieve. Bring a new world into being. Live the promise you believe. May that be so for you and me, my kindred, as we seek to bring into being the world God would have. Thank you, Carol. Thank you, Ryan. Thank you, Gerardo. And Robbie, thank you for the gift of your book and your presence with us today. This has been a rich conversation. Adios. Bye-bye.